For most of us today, washing wool seems like common sense. The modern mind pictures soap, steaming water, and the clean scent of detergent as a sign of purity and care. But in the Middle Ages, shepherds would have looked at that with disbelief. To them, washing raw wool was not just unnecessary, it was foolish. They saw something in unwashed fleece that the modern world forgot. In a time before running water or chemical detergents, peasants had to think differently about every resource they used. For medieval shepherds, wool was not simply a commodity, it was life itself. It clothed them, kept them warm in brutal winters, and formed one of the most valuable trades in all of Europe. But the secret to their success lay not in scrubbing the wool clean, but in preserving what nature had already built into it. Every sheep that grazed on medieval hills carried its own built-in armor, lanolin. This natural wax, secreted from the animal's skin, coated every fiber of its fleece. When left untouched, lanolin made the wool waterproof, dirt-resistant, and almost self-cleaning. The peasants who raised these animals didn't have laboratories or chemical insight, but through centuries of experience, they noticed something remarkable. When wool was left raw, the garments made from it lasted longer, stayed warmer when wet, and resisted the rot that plagued other fabrics. This wisdom didn't come from theory, it came from survival. Imagine a shepherd standing on a fog-soaked hillside, tending his flock through weeks of rain. His cloak, made from coarse, unwashed wool, would grow heavier with moisture, but never truly soaked through. Beneath it, his skin stayed warm. When he hung it by the fire at night, the droplets rolled away. That was the difference lanolin made. Modern wool is scoured, boiled, and stripped of its oils to make it soft for spinning and dyeing. But in that process, it loses much of its resilience. The medieval shepherds knew that the natural grease was the fleece's lifeblood. They treated it like a sacred ingredient. Instead of washing it away, they worked around it. Before spinning, wool was picked apart, carted by hand, and cleaned only enough to remove sticks and debris. Dirt and burrs were shaken out, not rinsed out. Water was precious, often drawn from wells or streams that had to serve entire villages. There was no luxury of wasting it on washing wool that nature had already perfected. But more importantly, washing could ruin the fiber's character. Wet wool was heavy, fragile, and easily felted. Once felted, it lost its stretch and became impossible to spin evenly. So medieval workers developed techniques that embraced lanolin's properties. They learned that greasy wool spun more smoothly. The natural oil lubricated the fibers as they twisted on the spindle, creating a strong, flexible thread that wouldn't snap under tension. When woven into cloth, that thread produced fabric that repelled wind and water alike. This wasn't mere luck or rustic ignorance. It was deliberate engineering. The greasy wool was carded on wooden paddles or teasel heads, and spun on drop spindles or grate wheels that rotated slowly enough to keep the oil intact. The result was a yarn far tougher than its modern equivalent. Across medieval Europe, the unwashed fleece was a quiet revolution. In the cold, damp climates of England, Wales, and Flanders, shepherds learned that keeping wool greasy allowed them to craft garments fit for storms and travel. Sailors wore oiled wool tunics that resisted sea spray. Monks and peasants wore coarse habits that never truly got wet, only damp. And armies, marching through rain and mud, relied on the same principle for their outer garments and tents. The lanolin coating wasn't just protection from rain, it acted as a kind of natural antiseptic. Dirt, sweat, and even minor stains brushed off easily. That's why medieval cloaks often appeared dirty by modern standards, but were surprisingly clean to the touch. The wool simply didn't absorb filth in the same way cotton or linen would. In fact, washing wool was reserved for special purposes, and even then, it was done with immense care. When wool was prepared for fine cloth like that used in monasteries or noble estates, it wasn't scoured with soap, but soaked in fermented liquids. These natural solutions, urine, stale beer, or even plant lye, dissolved some of the lanolin, but left enough to keep the fiber supple. The residue was then collected and repurposed. Medieval craftsmen actually saved lanolin from partially washed fleece, refining it into a balm for leather or skin. To the modern ear, that might sound primitive, but it was a complete cycle, nothing wasted, nothing destroyed, and the results speak for themselves. The wool garments of the Middle Ages lasted for decades. Some cloaks and tapestries have survived centuries, still intact in museums, their fibers strong and resilient. The genius of medieval shepherds lay in their understanding of balance. They didn't see dirt as the enemy. They saw the natural chemistry of the animal as a gift not to be disturbed. The lanolin that modern factories remove was the very thing that made medieval wool exceptional. Even the process of shearing reflected that philosophy. Sheep were usually shorn once a year, often in late spring, when their coats were thickest and most oily. Shepherds used iron shears, careful to cut close, but not wound the animal. The fleece came off in large sheets, still bound by the natural oils that gave it strength. Those oils preserved the wool through the months it would sit before spinning. When winter came, families gathered indoors to work with the greasy fleece. It was warm to the touch, pliable and fragrant with the scent of lanolin and smoke. The spinning wheel or spindle turned slowly by the hearth, twisting long, glossy strands that glistened in the firelight. That sheen came not from polish, but from the living oil of the wool itself. Once woven, the fabric was fulled, a controlled process of felting that thickened and tightened the cloth. But even here, medieval fullers never fully stripped away the lanolin. Instead, they beat and washed the cloth just enough to strengthen it, while keeping its weatherproof qualities intact. The result was broadcloth or frieze, fabrics that shed water and resisted wind for generations. In the damp climate of northern Europe, this made all the difference. Wool that retained its grease kept peasants alive through cold seasons when firewood was scarce and shelter thin. It created cloaks that could double as blankets, tunics that served as armor against the chill, and caps that stayed dry in sleet and rain. And the proof of their wisdom still stands today. Many medieval timber-framed buildings have wool felt, packed between beams as insulation, unchanged, still oily, still resilient. It hasn't rotted away because the lanolin repelled moisture. Medieval builders didn't waste a thing. Wool scraps, too coarse for clothing, became weatherproof barriers inside their homes. This understanding of nature's chemistry extended beyond shepherds. Medieval dyers and weavers worked with unwashed fleece because it accepted certain dyes better in its oily state. The lanolin acted as a binding agent, helping natural pigments like madder red or woad blue cling to the fiber more deeply. Colors in medieval tapestries remain vivid centuries later, a testament to that overlooked wisdom. Contrast that with the industrial era. When the textile revolution came, speed replaced tradition. Machines required clean, uniform fiber. So manufacturers began scouring wool in boiling water mixed with alkali solutions. It made the fibers soft and white, but lifeless. The lanolin was stripped away, the fibers weakened, and the natural resistance to rot vanished. The new fabrics looked refined but aged quickly. Within years, garments lost their shape, mildewed, or tore. Medieval shepherds might have smiled wryly at that. They would have known that perfection rarely comes from polishing away nature's roughness. Their world was built on respect for the material, not mastery over it. They worked with the wool as it came, guided by centuries of observation rather than chemistry textbooks. Even today, some traditional crafts still echo that heritage. In the Scottish Highlands and parts of rural Wales, old families still hand-spin grease wool yarns. Finished garments are warm, waterproof, and have a subtle glow that modern fabrics can't imitate. Fishermen's sweaters, known as ganzies, trace their lineage back to this very method. Knit from unscoured wool so they could repel seawater and protect the wearer from icy winds. Scientists have since confirmed what those medieval shepherds already knew. Lanolin not only waterproofs wool, but also protects it from bacteria, mold, and UV damage. The dense structure of raw wool fiber, when combined with natural oil, creates a microenvironment hostile to decay. It breathes but doesn't soak, resists odor, and practically cleans itself. Medieval people discovered this through experience, not experiment. Their so-called dirty wool was, in truth, one of nature's most sophisticated textiles. But there's another layer to this story, one that reveals how deeply medieval society understood sustainability long before the word existed. Every part of the wool cycle was regenerative. Sheep grazed on pastures that fertilized themselves. Their wool was clipped, not killed. The lanolin served multiple purposes: balm, preservative, lubricant. Even the dirty wash water, when used, became fertilizer. What the modern world sees as waste, they saw as resource. This philosophy was embedded in their worldview. In medieval life, nothing truly died. It transformed. A sheep's fleece became a cloak. That cloak, when worn out, became padding for armor or lining for boots. When beyond use, it was burned for heat. Every stage honored the material. Washing wool too early would have broken that chain, wasting what nature gave freely. If you walk through old monasteries or rural museums today, you can still smell the faint waxy scent of medieval wool. It's a reminder of an age when people trusted nature's engineering more than their own. They didn't chase perfection through purity, but through harmony. That, perhaps, is the greatest lesson the medieval shepherd left us. In our modern rush to sanitize, polish, and purify, we often destroy the very qualities that make things last. The lanolin we strip from wool becomes an industrial byproduct we sell back as hand cream. The wood preservatives we buy in cans mimic what natural oils once achieved effortlessly. The peasants who never washed their wool weren't ignorant. They were practical chemists. Their work was guided by a kind of inherited intuition, shaped by generations who learned through touch, smell, and time. They understood that the best protection often comes from leaving nature's design intact. When medieval shepherds brushed their sheep or spun greasy yarn by the fire, they were participating in a system that balanced simplicity and genius. They preserved more than wool. They preserved wisdom, the art of restraint. And in a world that now fights rot with chemicals, we might look back and realize that the real innovation wasn't an invention, but an observation. The next time you pull on a wool sweater or see an ancient timber roof still standing after centuries, remember that it wasn't washed, polished, or purified to perfection. It survived because someone, long ago, understood that nature already knew what it was doing. The secret of medieval wool wasn't hidden in some lost manuscript or coded formula. It was right there in the fields, written in the lanolin that gleamed on a sheep's back under the morning sun. If you enjoy learning how forgotten crafts, simple tools, and quiet ingenuity built the world we live in, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We bring history's most fascinating survival methods, inventions, and everyday wisdom back to life, one story at a time. Sometimes the smartest ideas are the ones we stop believing in.